Just one final note on feudalism, and then I'll pick up your phone calls. When I wrote Unequal Protection back in 1999, 2000, whatever the year was that I wrote this book, actually it took me about 2 years to write it. I read a book by a fellow by the name of Mark Bloch, who's one of the world's most eminent authorities on feudalism. And his book is called Feudal Society. He's one of the great 20th century scholars of feudal history of Europe. And he writes, in almost every case, both with European feudalism and feudalism in China, South America, and Japan, quote, feudalism coincided with a profound weakening of the state, particularly in its protective capacity. Got this? The one thing that can push back against concentrated wealth, the wealth of feudal lords, the wealth of corporate masters, the wealth of billionaires, the one thing that can hold that wealth in check or push back against it on behalf of the average working person is the state. And this is why conservatives constantly talk about how much they hate big government, because big government is the only thing that can constrain big banks, big chemical companies, big AI companies, big telco companies, big transportation companies, big airlines, big pharmaceutical companies, big food combines, big fast food, I mean, you name it, big retailers. The only thing that can hold back all these big sectors of our economy so that they don't just trample the average working person is government, big government. Because the bigger the billionaire sector is, the bigger the government that's going to hold them in check has to be. And right now it's not big enough to hold them in check. You've got the Koch brothers creating their own political party for all practical purposes. So Mark Bloch writes, feudalism coincided with a profound weakening in the state, particularly in its protective capacity. He said, whether the power and wealth agent that takes the place of government is a local baron, lord, king, or corporation, if it has, this is actually my writing in Unequal Protection, if it has greater power in the lives of individuals than does a representative government, that culture has dissolved into feudalism. Bluntly, Bloch states, the feudal system, quote, the feudal system means the rigorous economic subjection of a host of a humble folk to a few powerful men. End of quote. Doesn't mean the end of government, but instead the subordination of government to the interests of the feudal lords. As Mark Bloch, the expert on feudalism, wrote, the concept of the state never absolutely disappeared in feudal Europe, and where it retained the most vitality, men continued to call themselves free. Back to my writing in Unequal Protection, I wrote, the transition from a governmental society to a feudal society is marked by the rapid accumulation of power and wealth in a few hands, with a corresponding reduction in the power and responsibilities of government. Once the rich and powerful gain control of the government, I wrote this 16 years ago, once the rich and powerful gain control of the government, they turn it upon itself, usually first eliminating its taxation processes as it applies to themselves. As Mark Bloch, the scholar of these things, said, quote, nobles need not pay taxes. And as I pointed out in the book, now this is just how bizarre it's gotten. Keep in mind, I wrote this book in 1999, 2000. This was before the George W. Bush presidency, which put Reaganomics on steroids and wildly exacerbated on unequal incomes. You know, he had huge tax cut for billionaires. But here's what I wrote in 1999. Bringing this to today, consider that in 1982, just before the Reagan supply-side tax cut, the average wealth of the Forbes 400 was $200 million each. $200 million? Really? The Forbes 400? Just 4 years later, their average wealth was $500 million each, aided by massive tax cuts. Today, those 400 people, this is in 1990, own wealth equivalent to 1/8 of the entire GDP of the United States. Well, today, in 2015, those 400 people own wealth equal to 1/2 of the American population's wealth. That's how bad it's gotten and how fast it's gotten there. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 51, he wrote, "In a society under the forms in which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may be truly said to reign. And under such circumstances, eventually even the most powerful factions or parties will be gradually induced by a like motive to wish for a government which will protect all parties, the weaker as well as the more powerful." So Alexander Hamilton suggesting that there's a cycle to this. The feudalists rise up, they gain control of the average working person, they basically strangle them economically, politically, and using force, and then using that force, they expand their own power and wealth. Are we there yet? I would say we've been there since mid-90s. In a really serious way. We just didn't realize it. I mean, arguably, we've been there since 81, 82, and we just didn't realize it because Reagan planted all the seeds for the rise of a feudal elite. And that feudal elite is now reaching out and it has already taken control of one entire political party in the United States and is taking a good bite out of the other. This is astonishing.